the fact of the matter is that in 1971, Lewis Powell came up with this plan, and in response, actually, back in the early 50s, Russell Kirk wrote a book called The Conservative Mind, in which he predicted that if the middle class continued to grow, if average working people got wealthy enough, that it would create societal upheaval, that young people would start ignoring their elders, that women would no longer know their place, that people of color would no longer know their place, and that society would collapse, American society. And at the time, I mean, basically the only people who paid attention to him were William F. Buckley and Barry Goldwater. Everybody else considered him a crank. But then the 60s happened. And in 61, they legalized the birth control pill. And now you had the women's movement, and moving along. We had Vietnam and the draft. You had students saying, hell no, I'm not going to go. You had Martin Luther King, the civil rights movement, and Black people saying, wait a minute, what about our rights? And at that point, the conservatives and the Republicans basically said, holy cow, Russell Kirk was right. We've got to gut this middle class. We've got to do away with this middle class. And so, their effort. So in 71, Lewis Powell came up with a plan to do it, to execute what Russell Kirk had identified. It was called the Powell Memo. In 72, Nixon put him on the Supreme Court. In 76, he voted in favor of a decision called Buckley versus Vallejo, which said that money, if rich people gave money to politicians to the point that they owned the politician, that was no longer to be called bribery. That was now called free speech, protected by the First Amendment. The money wasn't money, it was speech. And then 2 years later in 78, in a decision that Lewis Powell himself wrote on the Supreme Court, First National Bank versus Bellotti, he ruled, or the court ruled, that this applies to corporations as well. They too can buy politicians because they're persons, and therefore entitled to rights under the Bill of Rights, which is insane, but nonetheless, there it is. So this, allowed the oil industry basically and some fossil fuel billionaires to just float Reagan into the White House on this ocean of oil money, and begin the process of gutting the American middle class, which was the charge he was given by Russell Kirk and Barry Goldwater and William F. Buckley and the intelligentsia of the Republican Party was, at this point, you had 2/3 of America had the equivalent of a union job. A third of America had union jobs, which set the wage floor locally, and benefits floors, which was another third of America. So 2/3 of Americans were living solidly in the middle class. And by the way, it's now under 45%. And Reagan's job was to cut that down below 50%, because that, these guys believed, was the source of the social instability that was causing our cities to be on fire in the 70s, and, et cetera, et cetera. And so the first thing he did was cut taxes on rich people. And then, it just, went on from there, the whole neoliberalism thing. That was my last book, The Hidden History of Neoliberalism, how Reaganism gutted the American middle class. And, but, tax policy was the principal vehicle of it. And when you combine that now, and thus now your average American billionaire pays 3.4% in income taxes. You combine that with their ability to freely bribe politicians, Supreme Court justices, presidents, with no consequences whatsoever because of these Supreme Court decisions, Citizens United in 2010 tripling down on Buckley and Bellotti. Yeah. Now what we have is basically oligarchy. We have a protected class that has bought the political class. It's very tragic.
Yeah, it's very scary and it's very frustrating. And I feel like that is the motivation for why Peter and I do what we do. Like, that's the whole point, is I feel like if we can't somehow get the corporate tentacles out of our government, that it's not going to get better. Like, it's not just going to get better with those corporate tentacles there. They're not going to allow for that. So it's just, I feel like Sisyphus.
Yeah. And the billionaire tentacles too. Yes, you're absolutely right. This is the cancer that the Supreme Court embedded at the heart of our democracy, and we've got to remove it.
Yeah.
Speaking with Thom Hartmann of the Thom Hartmann Show. Thom, final thoughts regarding what has always been often said from the conservative and libertarian side of the political spectrum. We are not a democracy. We are a constitutional republic. How do you respond to that?
Well, we are a constitutional republic and we are a democracy. The words were interchangeable up until 1788, more or less. I mean, literally interchangeable. Dictionary, democracy, see republic, republic, see democracy, that kind of thing. Then James Madison, when he was selling the Constitution, created this distinction that showed up in the Federalist Papers, which was because they were there was significant opposition, frankly, to the Constitution, mostly from very wealthy people in the United States, and who wanted to go back to the Articles of Confederation that kept the states very, very strong and allowed the oligarchs to basically run the states. And so, what he said was, democracy is mob rule, and we're not doing that. We're doing a representative democracy. We will elect representatives, and we're going to refer to that going forward as a republic or as a Republican form of government. So there was this kind of fad that lasted about a decade, where everybody who was in favor of the Constitution and America referred to themselves as Republicans and Republican form of government. When Jefferson created the Democratic Party, he referred to it, the original name of it was the Democratic Republicans. They dropped the word Republican in the 1820s and just became the Democratic Party. But they were all clear that this was a democracy. It was just a representative democracy. We still had, majority. We still had elections, and whoever won the majority of the votes became the leader. The it's a republic, not a democracy thing really picked up steam in the United States in the 1950s. And in 1956, Joe McCarthy was pushing a whole bunch of memes really aggressively. One was that Republicans should never refer to the Democratic Party as the Democratic Party, because Democratic sounds too nice. Instead, he said, and this is a verbatim quote, he said, "Call it the Democrat Party with an emphasis on the rat." So, that's now doctrine in the Republican Party. Right. They don't refer to the Democratic Party by its real name. There is no such thing as the Democrat Party, but it exists on Fox News. Then another one that he said was, democracy sounds too much like the Democratic Party, so we don't want to refer to America as a democracy. We want to refer to it as a republic because we're Republicans. Right. And that's really where that whole shtick started.
Thanks for watching. If you want to support our mission to transform politics into service, please like this video, subscribe, follow us on social media, and consider joining our Patreon, where you'll get early access to our interviews as well as other exclusive content. Links are in the description. Peace out.